Um, First, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today to this talk. This is the Bioethics Research Rounds here at the University of Colorado. My name is Eric Campbell. I'm a professor of medicine and the director of research at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities here at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. The purpose of this series is to provide a national forum to highlight really breakthrough empirical bioethics research by some of the leading scholars in ethics and policy around the world. I want to begin by introducing our discussant for today's talk, Professor Lisa Bero. Dr. Bero is a professor of medicine here at the University of Colorado, and she's the chief scientist in the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. Dr. Bero's an internationally recognized expert in evidence synthesis, and her work tends to focus on things like tobacco control, pharmaceutical policy, and FDA policy, and evidence synthesis. Dr. Bero will lead the discussion today following our presentation. Our presentation today will come from Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch. Holly is an assistant professor of medical ethics and law at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Lynch conducts empirical research in clinical research ethics, access to investigational medicines outside of clinical trials, and FDA policy. Dr. Lynch has received numerous national awards for her work, and she currently serves as a fellow of both the Hastings Center and the Greenwald Faculty Scholars Program. Prior to going to UPenn, Dr. Lynch was the executive director of the Bioethics and Health Law Research Program at Harvard Medical School. She will be presenting the results today on her newest studies looking at academic oncologists' experiences with expanded access pathway to investigational drugs. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Lynch. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me virtually. I am going to take just a second to share my slides here. Can you see that okay? I hope.
Sure.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Great. Well, so again, thanks so much for that warm welcome. I'm really looking forward to hearing Dr. Bero's reactions to my findings and to talking with all of you who are in the audience. And as Dr. Campbell mentioned, I'm going to be presenting findings of an interview project that I recently completed, talking with academic oncologists about their use of the expanded access pathway by which their patients can gain access to investigational drugs. So just a few slides by way of background. This work was funded by a Greenwald Foundation Faculty Scholars Award, in which I was focusing broadly on questions around gatekeeping in the context of healthcare, and expanded access is one instance in which patients might be kept from getting access to investigational products that they might be very interested in trying, and they need a lot of different people to open the gate for them. I'm doing current work related to post-market studies after FDA approval, as well as some pre-approval access mechanisms that's funded by Arnold Ventures. And I just want to take a moment to recognize my collaborators on the projects that I'm going to talk to you about today. Tasnim Salam and Patrick Gould were both Masters of Bioethics students at Penn. They have both graduated, and this was part of the work that they did as students in the program, as well as my colleagues, Doctors Kimberly and Bateman House, who are experts in the expanded access pathway. So just by way of like road mapping, where I'm hoping we can go in this conversation, I'll talk to you a bit about the expanded access pathway and the regulatory parameters surrounding it. Then I'll share the findings from this interview study, some of our key insights that we think are unique from the work that we did. And then I'll lay out some open research questions, right? Like every good research project results in many more questions that need to be asked and answered. And so I have a lot out of this one. So just to kind of set the stage here, it's important to recognize that we have a system in the US, which is similar in many parts of the world, where you are unable to access whatever drugs you want. You have to first have products be approved by a government entity. In our case, it's the US Food and Drug Administration. And, that can create some challenges and opportunities, right? Where we rely on the government to serve as a gatekeeper, right? They have to open the door for these investigational products to be allowed on the market in the first place. And that's actually really important for a couple of reasons, but the most important one that I want to highlight for our purposes today is that this creates an information forcing function. If companies were allowed to just put their products on the market without having to go through this approval process, they are more likely to kind of put out the minimum amount of information about their products. But patients and those who are treating them need lots of information about the drugs that they are going to use in the course of clinical care. So FDA can require certain studies to be done to answer questions related to the safety and effectiveness of those products. And those studies are very unlikely to be done if we just had a purely market-based system. There's other benefits of this pre-market approval requirement, including promoting innovation by keeping competitive products off the market for a period of time. Sometimes that can be abused, but that is a totally different topic for another day. And it can also serve as kind of heuristic for clinicians and patients to rely on FDA's approval process to say, look, this drug has been approved by FDA, so I think it's a product, I think I should be willing to prescribe it and take it. It would be asking a lot of clinicians and patients to have to go through all of the studies that that get published in medical journals and evaluate those data for themselves, right? So we can rely on this expert agency to make those judgments for us. However, this pre-approval requirement does create some dilemmas. It entails a trade-off, right? The good thing about it is that unsafe and ineffective products are kept off the market. The challenge, of course, is that there are going to be effective and safe products that are delayed from entering the market while we develop evidence that those products work. I'm hearing a little background noise, and I just want to make sure that no one's trying to get my attention. I hope.
No, I think some folks aren't on mute, so if everybody could mute, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, great. I can only see myself right now, so just wanted to make sure nothing was going wrong on my end. So, this idea, right, that we might be precluding patients from taking products that are safe and effective is a danger of this pre-market approval requirement. The key thing, though, is that we only know in hindsight that there were products that are safe and effective that we've had to wait to get. We don't know at the beginning of that testing period what's going to work out and what isn't. So this raises the question, should everybody have to wait while we figure out which products are safe and effective? What about those patients who are likely to die in the meantime or have their clinical condition seriously deteriorate during the process of going through clinical trials and FDA approval processes? Those patients understandably are likely to have a higher risk tolerance, right? They're more likely to say, look, it's okay if we're not sure that this product works, or it's okay if there might be some risks that we haven't figured out with this product. My alternative, right, is to get worse and potentially to die. So I'm willing to take things before we have a high level of certainty about them. Now, I don't want to suggest that patients who are facing these really dire circumstances can't be harmed, right? Of course they can. You can, have your death hastened, you can experience lots of side effects, you can have financial toxicities. So these are kind of background considerations as we assess what kind of exceptions to the rule ought to be allowed. Now, it's not the case that everybody must wait until FDA grants approval. If you are a patient who is enrolled in a clinical trial, you will have access to investigational medicines before they come on the market, but that's not the purpose of the clinical trial, right? The access is kind of incidental to the focus of the trial, which is to gather information about safety and effectiveness. You're also, of course, not guaranteed to get the intervention of interest. You might be randomized to placebo or other standard of care. And there's also lots of barriers we know of to participating in clinical research. You might be excluded based on some comorbidities, for example, age, date-sense diagnoses, and then there's geographic and financial barriers to participation. So FDA has created another alternative mechanism to gain access to investigational medicines before they've gone through the approval process, and that's the expanded access pathway that we're going to spend the rest of this conversation talking about. So let me just tell you kind of a bit about the legal standards around expanded access, which you might sometimes hear people refer to as compassionate use or pre-approval access. These are the core legal requirements to be eligible to gain access to an investigational drug for treatment use outside of a clinical trial. You have to be a patient that has a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition. And it has to be true that there's no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy. Notice that the requirement is not explicitly for there to be, no stone left unturned. You've tried everything else. This is a last resort. That's not the legal requirement. If your physician says nothing is likely to be as good as this investigational product, then you would meet that eligibility criterion. And that comes up in some of our interview findings. FDA has to be convinced that the potential benefit of the investigational product justifies the potential risk. And then there are two key safeguards that are in red. And they're in red because they are there to protect the ability to get clinical trials done. We cannot have expanded access interfere with drug development, right? We need to get those trials done. That's how we're going to get evidence that allows us to decide whether these products are safe and effective. And so expanded access is intended to be this exceptional pathway if you're unable to participate in a trial, right? So one component is that you couldn't get the drug of interest through another study. And FDA has to be convinced that if the company provides expanded access, that doing so won't interfere or compromise clinical development. I'll also mention that there are different types of expanded access. You can get single patient use, meaning, the physician talks with the company and asks for permission for one patient. There's also intermediate cohorts as well as treatment protocols. So you can kind of have a medium-sized group or a larger group of patients who are gaining access before approval. Now, just to kind of walk through some of the complexity of what this would actually look like and the various gatekeepers involved, the way single patient expanded access would work is that the doctor and patient discuss the various options, they decide that those eligibility criteria are met, and then ask the manufacturer if the manufacturer would be willing to provide access to the drug. The company can say no. There is no legal requirement that they say yes. Sometimes they say no because they don't have the manufacturing capacity beyond clinical trials, or there's not a mechanism to pay for providing expanded access, or they're worried about adverse events, or they think it just won't work for this patient. There's no requirement that the company says yes. But if they do, they tell FDA that it's okay. Then you have to submit necessary paperwork to FDA. FDA has to evaluate those criteria that I just mentioned. And if FDA says yes, you also need an institutional review board to sign off, right? So you need to get a lot of yeses in order for this pathway to be made available to you. And FDA has at various points tried to streamline this pathway, for example, allowing one member of the IRB to sign off, streamlining the paperwork necessary, and really trying to turn around the requests as quickly as possible. Now, don't get bogged down in the numbers here. The key thing I want you to focus on are the 99%. All this slide is intended to show is that FDA is saying yes to expanded access requests almost 100% of the time. The numbers you see on this slide are slightly inflated because they include that date range at the top includes the early days of COVID, where we were seeing a lot of expanded access requests, including for remdesivir. But again, if you look at these different rows, you can see that FDA is continuing to say yes almost all of the time. But they're not just saying yes in a rubber stamp kind of way. In about 10% of cases, we heard from a previous FDA commissioner, the agency is requiring some changes to expanded access. So things like adjust the dosing amount, have additional safety monitoring, make sure you say this in the process of informed consent. And we have to keep in mind that FDA might have some confidential information that clinicians don't have because they have access to a bunch of sponsor information across companies, right? So they might have information about a drug class that might not be available to individuals. There are also some important safeguards to be aware of in the expanded access regulations. So the physician who's providing expanded access to their patient, even though it's for treatment use outside of a trial, that doctor is taking on the regulatory responsibility of an investigator. Those responsibilities are reduced compared to what would happen in a regular clinical trial, but there are requirements for adverse event reporting to the sponsor. You have to get the equivalent of research informed consent, and as I mentioned, you have to get IRB approval. And then companies are also retaining their regulatory responsibilities as sponsors. They have an obligation to make reports of serious unanticipated adverse events to FDA. And at the conclusion of the patient's treatment, there's some very basic information about outcomes that has to be provided to FDA. And I mentioned just briefly about the cost, right? Sometimes companies say, no, we can't afford to do this, especially if they're a small company with no approved products. The regulations do allow companies to charge the direct cost for providing expanded access to patients, but they're not allowed to profit. And many times, larger companies will just provide the drugs for free. Now, there have been a number of challenges that have been identified with the expanded access pathway. You need doctors to be aware of it. We're going to talk quite a bit about the logistical burdens that came up in the course of the interviews. I've already mentioned that companies might say no, and that cost challenge does become an issue if you want a product from a smaller company. FDA has taken some steps to increase awareness. The Oncology Center of Excellence has a program called Project Facilitate that is intended to serve as kind of a liaison process between oncologists and companies who might be willing to provide expanded access. There are legal requirements to post your expanded access policy on a publicly accessible website, to post whether expanded access is available when you're registering a clinical trial. I mentioned before that FDA has taken some steps to reduce the paperwork and to ease the path to IRB approval, as well as to encourage companies to be willing to say yes. So FDA has gone on the record to say, look, we understand that expanded access patients are going to be different from your clinical trial population. If something goes wrong with an expanded access patient, we're not necessarily going to put a clinical hold on your trial, for example, but there's still a number of reasons why companies might say no. So that's all by way of background here. Let me now transition to tell you a bit more about the study that my team and I did. So the first paper from this study was published in JAMA Network Open a couple of months ago, and then the final paper will be coming out, I believe, at the end of next week. Now, expanded access is not limited to the oncology setting. It's available for any investigational product that meets those criteria that I mentioned previously. So why did we focus on oncologists for this study? We could have, examined how FDA handles things or how companies handle things. We do know quite a bit about how FDA approaches expanded access. The agency has been pretty forthcoming about their data. Companies play a really important role and are understudied. So that's on my research agenda. But we went after physicians first as kind of the core central gatekeeper to this process. And so if you see on the diagram here, the doctor has to liaise with the patient and the company and FDA and the IRB. So if the doctor is unwilling to proceed, then the rest of it really falls apart. And we decided to focus on oncologists specifically because that's one of the most common indications for expanded access drugs. Now, in terms of what the existing literature tells us, there has been increasing attention to expanded access in the empirical literature, including in the oncology space for many of the reasons that I just described. So there's been some survey work with pediatric hematologists and oncologists showing that they have variable levels of comfort with expanded access, and many are unfamiliar with the logistics required, right? What steps would they actually have to take to gain access to this pathway for their patients? There have been some surveys with community oncologists showing that some have been successful in pursuing expanded access. Although when you ask them to describe the differences between the expanded access pathway and an alternative pathway, which we can talk about during the Q&A, called right to try, many are really struggling to differentiate between those two. Some interview work with international physicians has shown a mix of support for and concern about early access. Concerns, right, that we don't actually know that these products work, and so we have to be careful about making them available to patients in need. And then also a lot of attention to the practical barriers that are associated with pursuing this pathway. Really great project out of the Mayo Clinic examined oncologists' perceptions of patient rationales for seeking investigational drugs and the factors influencing oncologists' decisions to pursue. And then we really have seen in the literature that physicians have a positive impression of expanded access, but they're facing a number of barriers, and that's what we were hoping to address in our project. Get the slide. There we go. Now, we further limited our focus to academic oncologists rather than, for example, community oncologists, because they were accessible to me. I was able to work with some academic medical center IRBs to figure out who had submitted single patient expanded access requests to those IRBs so that I could reach out to them and invite them to participate in the study. And we also thought, if we're focused on kind of these logistical barriers, if academic physicians who are working at very well-resourced academic medical centers are struggling with expanded access, then it's likely other physicians in other practice areas, types of clinical environments are probably struggling even worse. So we wanted to get a sense of, how do these oncologists perceive the relevance of FDA approval, considering they're trying to gain access to investigational products that have not yet received FDA approval? How are they thinking about expanded access in the context of routine clinical care? What kind of inequities are they worried about in access to this pathway? What resources do they need? How satisfied are they with the other gatekeepers in that diagram that I mentioned? And a kind of emerging issue is this idea that maybe we could learn something from expanded access patients. And so perspectives on the value of gathering data from people who get expanded access drugs. So I mentioned that I worked with IRBs to gain access to, figure out who we should invite. So we limited our interview study to adult and pediatric oncologists who had submitted at least one single patient expanded access request to their IRB in about the 6 years before the COVID pandemic hit. And that was really, a period of time that we figured people would remember what the process had been like for them. And we worked with the IRBs at Penn, which is my home institution, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, NYU Langone Health, and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and ultimately conducted 25 interviews with this population. Took a bit longer to get the interviews done than we had hoped because we launched right at the start of the pandemic. So this is just some of the kind of demographics of the people who were in our sample. We had about a 60-40 split of adult versus pediatric oncologists. Most of our sample came from the Dana-Farber, and most of the oncologists that we spoke with had more than 10 years of clinical experience after they had completed their fellowship. Most people that we spoke to had discussed expanded access with their patients or families fewer than 3 times per year over that 6-year period that we were interested in, but a few did so a lot more often. You can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but 75 or more conversations, at least 2 physicians in our sample indicated a very high level of frequency. And that's the first kind of finding that I would like to discuss with you, right? How often are people engaging in these discussions? So as I mentioned, most oncologists reported pretty infrequent expanded access discussions. And when we asked them, what were the factors that played a role in whether they even talked with their patients about this pathway, there were some kind of usual suspects. What did the pipeline of new drugs look like, investigational drugs? Was there even anything to offer patients through expanded access? They talked about whether trials were available. If there were trials available, then they would, the oncologists would typically shunt their patients in that direction rather than pursuing expanded access. And then they also often said, well, look, in my area of clinical practice, FDA had just approved a new drug, and so I didn't need to use expanded access. It wasn't something that was coming up for my patients because they had access to an approved drug. One of our hypotheses was that there was a lot of chatter about the right to try pathway, which came on the scene in about 2014 and really kind of hit a high point in 2018 with passage of a federal right to try law about a year before we did our study. And so we thought that that chatter might have increased patient awareness and attention to the possibility of gaining access to investigational drugs. But what we heard from the oncologists in our sample was that they were really not seeing an increase in these discussions happening over time. And the couple who said, yes, they have seen an uptick, didn't attribute it to right to try. Instead, they attributed it to social media, saying that they had a very connected patient population. And so word would kind of spread about new investigational options that might be something worth pursuing. Now, one of the key findings of our project was, we went into this thinking expanded access is so unusual. It's this exceptional regulatory pathway. But what the oncologist said to us was, it's just another treatment option. We're not thinking about the regulatory pathway by which we can access a product. We are thinking about our patients and their clinical needs. And we're looking around to see what drugs might be most beneficial to them. Whether it's an approved drug or an unapproved drug doesn't actually matter so much, at least according to the oncologists in our sample. Once we've identified the best drug, then we figure out how to get our hands on it. So they were really viewing the expanded access pathway as incidental to this clinical judgment about what was best for their patients. Now, that kind of made us step back and say, well, if you're so focused on, just what's best for your patient, are you thinking about the level of data that's available, right? Because the level of data would be much lower for an unapproved product. And the answer to that was data were still very central to the treatment decisions of these oncologists. And so they, of course, were having a preference for drugs that were already approved. And if they didn't have an approved option available, as I mentioned, they would push their patients to participate in available trial options. And they said, look, if we don't know that, if there's not an approved product, the best way to gather evidence is to encourage our patients to participate in clinical trials. And so that was kind of the priority is approved product, trial, and then, access through the expanded access pathway. However, many said explicitly that expanded access is not necessarily a last resort. Now, remember, the regulatory requirement is that there's no comparable alternative, but the way oncologists in our sample were perceiving that was not that their patients had to have tried and exhausted every conceivable option, leaving only this investigational drug as something that they could try. Instead, they might decide that the investigational drug was going to be best for their patients, given the available data. And many of them said, I'm very connected into the clinical trial world. I'm running trials. I'm at these conferences. I see what's happening in the investigational drug space. And so that's how they were able to decide that this was something worth pursuing. And in that regard, they were quite confident in their ability to analyze the investigational data about these drugs. We kind of asked them, did you feel like you needed to wait for FDA approval? They were not down on FDA, but they basically said, no, we can read the data for ourselves and decide whether these products are appropriate to pursue for our patients. Now, when we talked to them about how they weighed the benefits, risks, and burdens of the expanded access pathway, almost to a T, they said they would not pursue expanded access unless they were certain that the drug had some chance of offering benefit. I don't mean certain that it would offer benefit, but certain that it was plausible to offer benefit. We sometimes heard from pediatric oncologists that they were willing to, pursue every conceivable option. They would use the phrase, leave no stone unturned. And often they said, why would this come up with pediatric oncologists? They would sometimes say, look, we take care of the child and the family. And they wanted to make sure that parents felt that they had done everything that they could do to help save their child's life. But even pediatric oncologists were not willing to just pursue anything, even if it had no prospect of benefit. They did, consider the burden on the patient and the patient's family. And occasionally they would say, well, I considered what a pain in the ass it was going to be for me as the physician to pursue these things. But that burden on the oncologist of pursuing the request, at least no one disclosed to us that precluded them for pursuing access through this pathway. We did kind of a sorting exercise of the factors that the oncologist said influenced their decision to offer expanded access. These are not statistically significant differences between the adult and pediatric oncologists. We had a very small sample. So these are just the raw numbers. The darker bars are the adult oncologists. Lighter bars are the pediatric oncologists. And you can see consideration of the clinical risks and benefits and the data available about the products were heavily on these oncologists' minds, as was the administrative hassle and the available alternatives. And then you can see the difference on the desire to leave no stone unturned, right? We were seeing that come up a lot more often with the pediatric oncologists. Now, we also thought about, the doctor-patient relationship and how pursuing expanded access might influence that. We heard from the oncologists that they were almost always the one to raise the idea of expanded access rather than patients and families coming in and saying, oh, there's this investigational product I'd like to try. And they would only offer it, again, if they were convinced it could be helpful. Sometimes they would even go to the company and make sure the company would say yes before raising it as an option with their patients, so as to not kind of create, get people's hopes up for something that wouldn't ultimately come through. The oncologist kind of felt like the issues that would arise in these expanded access discussions were pretty familiar. They were talking about avoiding false hope, making sure patients weren't trying to pursue things that were very unlikely to help them. Occasionally, they said they, would come into disagreement with patients about whether these options were appropriate to pursue, but typically we're able to get over those fairly easily by, going over the data and the rationale for their judgment in a bit more detail. And when they talked about their role in the expanded access pathway, the oncologists often said, it's my job to advocate to the patient, advocate to the company on behalf of the patient. If I think this drug is the best bet for them, I'm going to go to bat and help make sure that they can access it. But I'm also going to manage the patient's expectations. And if I don't think the drug is the right choice, then I am going to gatekeep. Now, here's where we get into some of the logistical challenges here. Very briefly, right, we asked the oncologists, like, how did you even know what expanded access was? They all said, well, we didn't have any formal training. It just happened in the course of my fellowship, for example, that there was a patient who needed something and I watched other oncologists gain access. And so I kind of learned by doing. Often they would say, I generally know what expanded access requires, but I'm relying on my team. I'll, identify the drug, I'll talk to the company, and then my regulatory team will deal with all of the paperwork and kind of the back and forth and make sure that we're compliant with what the law requires or anything that the company requires. So they're describing this division of labor. And that's really important because what it means is that they're relying on their research staff. None of the oncologists that we spoke to said that they had kind of devoted institutional resources to help them pursue expanded access. So this really did seem to be kind of a zero sum, right, where they were taking research personnel to pursue these single patient expanded access requests. And so there was some concern that that was diverting resources from the research enterprise. And occasionally folks would say, yeah, no one has told us we can't do this, but the institution, doesn't necessarily encourage us to pursue expanded access. Here's another really important finding from these interviews. We went in kind of thinking that we were going to hear a lot of complaining about the other gatekeepers because there's so many steps that you have to go through. And instead, what we heard from the oncologists were that companies aren't really a major barrier. FDA is not really a major barrier. Neither are IRBs. They're all three, imposing pretty reasonable requirements and asking pretty reasonable questions about these expanded access requests. And their turnaround times are all pretty quickly. The oncologist said that the companies typically say yes to them, but they recognize there was some selection bias. There could be some chatter in the community. Oh, this company always says no, don't bother going to them. So oncologists said they wouldn't typically pursue requests in that instance. And then we asked them, what kind of reasons for refusal from a company would be okay. And they said, look, sometimes the company has data that haven't been published that suggests the drug wouldn't be safe or effective in a patient like mine. Sometimes they say they don't have the manufacturing capacity. Sometimes they say, we're worried about negatively affecting our FDA approval. The oncologists were pretty much okay with any reason a company might provide for saying no, except having a blanket policy that they just don't provide expanded access. And the pediatric oncologists in particular found that to be very frustrating because they said sometimes companies just don't want anything to do with kids. And that's really, from their perspective, unfair to that patient population. Now, many of the oncologists in our sample described being very supportive of FDA's role in, serving as a gatekeeper to expanded access, saying, look, we need to avoid the Wild West here. It's good to have some independent oversight. The physician might be biased, the company might be biased, the patient wants the drug. So having FDA serving that independent review role was viewed as important. They, again, might share some information about safety that might not otherwise be available. And there was also an impression that FDA could prevent overuse of expanded access. If they're seeing a lot of single patient requests come in, they might step back and say, okay, let's actually include these people in a trial, even if it's a subgroup. Generally, FDA was perceived as helpful, and a number of oncologists recognize some of the positive changes that FDA has made to make the pathway go more smoothly over the past several years. The view about IRB involvement was that it's not such a problem, such that anyone was really giving a lot of grief about it. Sometimes they said the IRB review was redundant, given that FDA was already taking a look at it. But other oncologists said, look, FDA is making this broader judgment, but somebody at the institution should be overseeing this, including making sure that patients are giving adequate consent. So we saw pretty strong satisfaction with the other gatekeepers in our sample. We did hear from oncologists some discussion about equity issues related to expanded access. They, said, look, I treat all of the patients that get to me equally. Right, that was their self-report, but they acknowledged that not all patients were getting to these, to these academic medical centers in urban areas that are well-resourced and able to support pursuit of this pathway. They recognized, the privilege that they have of at least being knowledgeable about the investigational treatment options and knowledgeable about the expanded access pathway. And they said, look, patients have differential knowledge, differential self-advocacy. So they were hypothesizing that there are some likely inequities in access to this pathway, but none of them viewed cost as a source of inequity. And they said in every instance in which they had pursued expanded access, the companies had provided those drugs for free. Now, I had mentioned this point about expanded access data and whether and how it would be valuable. There has been increasing attention to real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making across the board, and that's kind of spilled over to the expanded access pathway. There have been a couple of examples where regulators in the US and in Europe have been willing to accept expanded access data in support of drug approval or approval of a new indication. And then there's also been some consideration that if companies can use expanded access data to support regulatory decisions, that increases the value proposition for companies. And so they might be therefore more willing to make expanded access available. So that was why we asked oncologists their views about the value of expanded access data. And they all said, yes, right? Safety data from expanded access is really important, right? We need to learn from these patients, especially if something goes wrong. But where the oncologists diverged was on the value of efficacy data gathered from expanded access patients. So several of the oncologists said, look, expanded access data, it's not coming from a randomized controlled trial. It's really just a bunch of case reports. And so it's not likely that we're going to learn much about efficacy that way. But other oncologists said, well, maybe, we can see some unexpected results in a subpopulation that can inform future research, and that it might be particularly helpful to learn about activity in rare disease areas. So there was some idea that it could be valuable. The overarching concern was related to the resource challenges I mentioned before, right? So you already have to jump through all of these hoops as an oncologist if you want to gain access to expanded access drugs for your patients. And then you might also be expected to gather additional data about them that wouldn't necessarily be funded because it's not funded like a clinical trial. And so there was worry about this unfunded burden. So I'm just about ready to wrap up. Let me flag some key insights, kind of pull it all together. What we learned from this project. There's some pros and cons from this idea that oncologists are viewing expanded access as just another tool. If they view it as non-exceptional, they might be more willing to use it. On the other hand, maybe that masks the truly exceptional nature of this pathway and the fact that we are providing patients access to an unapproved product. If they're not viewing expanded access as a last resort, then we might have some tension with a decision of whether to provide access to this investigational drug A through expanded access, or to encourage patients to participate in a clinical trial of investigational drug B, right? There might be some tension in which pathway you choose. This issue about the confidence in the oncologist's ability to parse the investigational data raises questions about, how good are they truly at doing that, right? These are investigational drugs. We have trial data, but it has not yet been reviewed by FDA. The studies might not yet be done. So there may be some concern about overconfidence. And then an equity concern. So if these oncologists are confident because they're running clinical trials, they roll in these circles where they're hearing about all of these things coming down the pike, community practitioners may not be in a position to hear those same things and be as enmeshed in what's coming along the pipeline for their patients. Now, I mentioned already how interesting it is that oncologists are satisfied with the role of other gatekeepers. And I think that's important because it suggests there's not much left to streamline, right? So you might have looked at that initial slide I showed you and it's, oh, you've got to have FDA say yes, and the company say yes, and the doctor say yes, and the IRB say yes. If doctors are satisfied that all of those roles are important, where can we trim the fat? And so that becomes a broader challenge of figuring out how do we address the resource concerns. If we think expanded access should be made more widely available, which is a question, an open question, who should be paying for it? How many resources should be devoted to this pathway? Very briefly, right, this was a qualitative study, so we were able to go deep, but we only spoke to 25 oncologists in limited practice settings, and we only spoke to people who had actually used the expanded access pathway. So it's likely, other populations would have different perspectives and experiences. And then finally, some open research questions that I'd love to talk with you all about. I mentioned this point about confidence, right? How accurate are the oncologist projections about benefit and risk? How confident should they be, right? These are patients that are likely to have an increased tolerance for risk. And that raises this challenge of it's quite difficult to figure out whether patients are benefiting from expanded access. Get to that point about the value of the efficacy data. We have a bunch of individual patients. If they get better, how do we know it was because of this intervention versus, kind of the natural progression of their disease, and maybe they would have gotten better anyway. And then this becomes a challenge if we can't tell whether patients are benefiting from this pathway. That raises the challenge of figuring out how many resources should be devoted to it. So with that, I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Holly. I'm trying to get my video on. Why can't I see it? That is very odd.
We can hear
Anyway,
you.
this is Lisa, everybody. I'm sorry you can't see me right now. That worked. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I know we have one question in the chat, but I'm hoping more will come in. But I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to reflect on your presentation and explore a couple of areas, one related to one of your new research questions and one regarding the policy implications of your work. And I really want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that our Grand Rounds here is an empirical ethics Grand Rounds. And I think that Dr. Fernandez Lynch's presentation was a really great example of that, because first she posed this ethical dilemma. And I think that's one thing required for Greenwall funding also, isn't it? To pose an ethical dilemma for them. And then you collected data to investigate it. So the ethical dilemma here was harm benefit of a drug versus access. And Dr. Fernandez Lynch conducted these interview studies and qualitative analysis to really dig into what was the decision-making process for the oncologists when they're weighing this ethical dilemma. And I have to say, maybe my view's a little skewed because I spend most of my life evaluating evidence, but I was so struck by how your participants seemed to address this ethical dilemma by assuming that they had sufficient data to assess harms and benefits. And, they really seem to justify their decision to go this expanded access route based on the evidence. So they said things like they select the medicine first and they see this as just another, pathway to get it to the patient, or it may be considered the best option if the available data indicate the drug is the best option, then they go for this. And the pediatric oncologists seem to be an exception. They seem to rely less on data and more on the no stone unturned or concerns about the family. And I certainly seen that in my work, where pediatricians are often saying they're working in a data-free zone. And so they just might be more comfortable making decisions based on the ethical concerns rather than the data, because there's often so little data for children. But I know this is one of your upcoming research questions. And before we get to the policy part, I'd really like you to explore this a bit, this idea about, should the oncologists be as confident as they are in recommending these drugs? Because it seems like they're making their decisions based on the evidence they have. And did they ever express any concerns about this evidence, or did they ever bring up actually ethical considerations about assessing the evidence itself? Like, where is it coming from? Are there conflicts of interest related to the evidence? Things like that. And maybe you can just say a little bit before we get to the policy implications about how you might explore that.
Yeah, those are all really, really great responses. The oncologists that we spoke to didn't use they were not themselves ethicists, right? So they were not viewing this as within an ethical framework, and they really were pretty straightforward in how they were thinking about this. They had patients in front of them who lacked good treatment options, and the oncologist had decided that the best option would be to pursue an investigational product. So they were confident enough. And that's where I think we could probe more deeply, is like, well, what does it mean to be confident enough? They focused on data, right? It wasn't just, oh, here's something that has some plausible mechanism of action, right? It was the idea that there were some trial data available to them, or they had experience with similar drugs. Sometimes they would say, I was running the trial. I had seen how patients were doing with this. And so that's what provided me with confidence that this was the right option for my patients. And then they also, recognized that it's not like they had a better option available. If they were pursuing expanded access, it was because there wasn't an approved drug and there wasn't a trial available to them. So sometimes we would say, well, look, what if you didn't think expanded access was a good option? What would you do then? And they would often just say, like, well, they kind of would look at me like, what do you think we would suggest, right? Palliation, right? They, you know, they recognize that there was this kind of list of things that they could try, and acknowledge that having less evidence was okay if you didn't have these higher quality options available.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point, that the criteria for evaluating evidence may differ depending on the options available. So anyway, I look forward to future work there. And just, I see we're getting a lot of questions, but let me just talk about the policy implications of your work, because I think this is so important. And you alluded to this right to try law. I guess it's a law, and I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that one of the issues with the right to try that differs from expanded access is that the FDA is basically cut out of it. And maybe you can explain this to the audience much better than I can, what this is. But I mean, your findings certainly seem to support that the oncologists at least valued the FDA's role here as a gatekeeper. And so how would that relate to right to try? And also maybe tell us a little bit of the history of that, like who sponsored it, you know, what kind of comments came in on it, whether there were kind of big financial sponsors there, anything like that.
So this is perfect. I actually took out 2 slides on right to try because I didn't have enough time to get to them. So I'm glad we can talk about this. So as I mentioned, right to try is a newer pathway. Expanded access has been around since informally, you know, for quite a while. Got added to the regulations in the late 80s through work of the HIV advocacy community, right? This idea that, you know, patients were dying without any treatment, approved treatment options. And so could we run clinical trials at the same time as giving some patients access to these investigational drugs that might be their only hope? And the, you know, the pathway has evolved and been improved since then. The initial approach to expanded access was for broader groups rather than single patients. Single patients were a later addition, right? Asking just for one patient at a time. So the right to try pathway differs from expanded access primarily in the way that you mentioned. You don't have to get FDA to sign off on, you know, using an investigational product through that pathway. You still go to the company and ask permission. It is not truly a right to try in that respect. It's a right to ask the company, and they can say no just the same way they can for expanded access. The genesis of the right to try laws were at the state level through a right-leaning think tank called the Goldwater Institute that sees its mission as getting the government out of people's lives. And this was, you know, an example, like kind of a poster child example. The tagline was, you know, why should a dying patient have to ask FDA or the government for permission to try to save their life? And the response for many in the bioethics community, myself included, was you already have a right to try or right to ask through the expanded access pathway. The expanded access pathway is working pretty well in the sense that FDA is saying yes almost all of the time. Right. And so right to try was going after the wrong target, cut FDA out of the process, but FDA is the one that's saying yes, right? It's not actually getting at the challenges. And so that raises further questions. Well, what does it actually mean for expanded access to be working well? Because we don't, I think, have a good normative answer to how many people should be getting it. Expanded access. I showed the slides with the numbers of requests. Those are a little bit misleading because they combine single patient requests as well as broader patient groups. So you can't, the number of patients who are helped are a bit higher than the numbers on those slides, but they're pretty low numbers, right? Like in the low, you know, the low thousands, even during COVID in the low 2000s, in terms of the number of requests that are coming in. Should it be the case that every patient that's exhausted their treatment options should be offered an investigational product? I think that's probably going too far, right? Because it's unlikely that they're all going to be helped by an investigational product. But the standard for saying yes from a regulatory perspective is simply that the possible benefits exceed the possible risks. That's a pretty low bar. So there's a lot of ethical work to be done about how common should this pathway really be? Is it something that should be typical, right? Offered as just another treatment option across disease areas, or is it something that really should be exceptional? And I see some questions in the chat about this, but it raises a fundamental question about how many resources should be devoted to this pathway and where those resources should come from. Right? We expect insurers or the government to pay for things that we know work. Expanded access drugs are things that we don't know work. That's why they have not yet been approved. And so you might think about things differently the further you get in the clinical development pathway, right? You can feel a lot more confident about expanded access at the end of phase 3 when you're just waiting for, you've got the data, you've got the results, you're just waiting for the product to come on the market and you're pretty sure you know what FDA will do, versus very early in the pathway. Expanded access, you don't even have to have gotten through phase 1. Right to try, you at least have to have gotten through phase 1, but you can envision kind of a different ethical approach depending on where in the clinical development pathway you are.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. And that really gets to the question of sort of how good does the evidence have to be, or how much confidence.
Yeah.
But
I will say very briefly, we asked the oncologists their views about right to try, and they had heard of it, but none of them had used it. I think all but one person who I can remember said, oh gosh, that's a terrible idea. But one person said, you know what, if it would get things to my patients sooner, I'm all for it, right? And so, you can kind of see from this logistical burden challenge, right, on the provider, they might be interested in just streamlining things as much as possible.
Yeah. So I think I know we do have some questions in the chat now, and Rosa Lawrence is monitoring our chat, and there were a couple on resources which I think are directly related. So do you want to summarize those, Rosa, and then we'll get to the others?
Yeah, there were a couple of questions just related to resource limitations. Who should provide funding to support running EAPs, and that, there's frequently not funding provided, so that burden falls on different stakeholders.
Yeah, that is a huge challenge about expanded access, something that our oncologists raised frequently. And they would say, look, I would call on my, my research staff to help me submit these requests and make sure that we were following all of the rules. But that wasn't what the research staff, that's not what they're funded to do, right? And so it becomes this challenge of pulling from one bucket to support another. And they would explicitly say, sometimes the conversation was had, how much do you want to pull from the research side to pursue something you're not sure is going to work for a single patient? Now, this ethical issue of who should pay for expanded access is, it's one I have not figured out for myself yet, because I think there are no perfect answers. Some people think the company should pay for this because they eventually, in their ideal, right, the company will eventually get their product approved, and they stand to benefit on the market from this drug. The companies say we are for-profit businesses, for better or worse. That is the model that we have in this country, right? They are not in the business of providing their drugs free of charge, right? So if they are providing it, it's through charity, which is not, their perceived obligation, right? If they're thinking about their obligation for profit maximization for their shareholders, it's not to provide, expanded access for free. So there have been efforts to have the government pay for expanded access. And I'll just mention briefly one example of this. Recently, the ALS community succeeded in getting legislation passed called Accelerating Clinical Therapies for ALS Act, I believe at the end of 2021. And it sets aside funds to do research with expanded access data. And so it's a way to potentially pay for expanded access while learning from it. But again, it's not through a the kind of, it's not through a rigorous, well-designed clinical trial. We still might be able to learn something from it, but it's different from funding, a trial the way we would normally think about those things. So that's a deep unanswered question. And I think if we knew more about who benefited from expanded access and how much and how to predict that, then we would have a better ability to answer this question about resources.
Yeah, and a lot came up with people's concerns here about the burden on the research staff for doing that. And I think we have like a minute remaining, but there was one question, maybe you can just do a quick yes, no. Were genetic interventions included under the expanded access in your interviews?
We didn't exclude them, but they were not a focus of the work. And so it wasn't something that came up as a theme in our discussions, that there was anything different about those compared to, drug interventions.
Another future question. Thank you, Holly.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all, Holly. This has been terrific. I want to thank you and Lisa and Rosa for doing this today, and everyone for attending. And we will be notifying all of you about future rounds and hope that you'll be able to attend. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Holly. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.